The morning air felt heavy, even before the sun had fully risen. The emergency response station was already alive with quiet movement. Boots on concrete, distant radio chatter, the low hum of engines warming up. It was the kind of place where people didn't waste words. Everyone moved with purpose, shaped by routine and pressure. She stood near the edge of the bay, adjusting the straps on her gear. Her uniform was still new enough to hold its sharp lines, but her hands showed the truth. Small scars, faint marks, signs of someone who had worked hard to get here. She checked everything twice, not because she didn't trust herself, but because she knew others were watching for mistakes. It was her first week on this unit. Most of the team had already formed their opinions. A few glanced her way, then quickly looked back at what they were doing. Some didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Others made no effort to engage at all. It wasn't open hostility. It was something quieter, colder. A kind of silent judgment that filled the space without needing to be spoken. She had felt it the moment she walked in on her first day. Still, she kept her focus. She had trained too long to be here. Long nights, harder mornings, pushing past limits she hadn't known she had. She didn't expect things to be easy, but she had hoped for a fair chance. Across the bay, a senior officer leaned against the side of an ambulance, arms crossed. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. He had been in this field for years, long enough to carry a reputation that didn't need explaining. People listened when he spoke. He had been watching her since she arrived. Finally, he pushed himself off the vehicle and walked toward a small group nearby. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried easily in the open space. "New recruit," he said, glancing in her direction without directly addressing her. "They're sending anyone these days." A couple of the others shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond. He continued, a faint smirk on his face. "Women paramedics lack strength. This job doesn't wait for you to catch your breath." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. No one immediately agreed, but no one challenged him either. She heard every word. For a brief moment, her hands paused on the strap she was tightening. Just a second. Then she continued, her movements steady, controlled. Her face didn't change. She didn't turn toward him. She didn't say anything. But inside, something settled deeper. She had heard things like that before. In training. During assessments. Even from people who later depended on her. It wasn't new, but it never became easy. Still, she refused to let it define her. Instead, she focused on the one thing she could control, her work. A few minutes later, the station quieted again. The team moved into position, checking equipment, reviewing assignments. Radios were tested. Supplies were counted. It was all routine, but every step mattered. She joined her assigned unit without hesitation. The others didn't speak much, but they didn't stop her either. That was enough for now. Time passed slowly, the kind of waiting that made every second feel stretched. It was a strange part of the job. Long stretches of calm, always balanced on the edge of urgency. Then, without warning, the radio came to life. A sharp voice cut through the silence, clear and urgent. A call had come in from a remote area, far beyond the usual reach of quick support. Details were limited, but the tone said enough. This wouldn't be simple. Everything changed instantly. The quiet station turned into motion. Doors opened. Engines roared to life. Voices overlapped with quick instructions. The team moved with practice speed, each person knowing exactly where to go. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her kit and climbed into the vehicle, securing her position as the doors slammed shut. The engine surged forward, pulling them out of the station and onto the open road. No one spoke for the first few minutes. The sound of the vehicle and the faint crackle of the radio filled the space. Outside, the city slowly gave way to less familiar terrain. Roads narrowed. Buildings thinned. The path ahead became more uncertain. She watched everything carefully. The driver's movements, the changing landscape, the small signals that experienced responders picked up without thinking. She absorbed it all. Across from her, the same senior officer sat quietly. His earlier words still lingered, even though he hadn't spoken since. He didn't look at her. but his presence was impossible to ignore. After a while, he finally broke the silence. "You've handled field calls like this before?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost casual. She met his gaze briefly, then nodded. "Yes." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing something he hadn't decided yet. Then he leaned back slightly. "This one won't be routine," he said. "Out there, things don't go by the book." "I understand," she replied calmly. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the road ahead. "We'll see," he said quietly. The vehicle continued forward, the distance growing between them and the familiar safety of the station. As they moved deeper into the remote area, the road became rougher. The driver slowed slightly, navigating uneven ground and narrow turns. Dust rose behind them, hanging in the air before slowly settling. The radio crackled again, updating their position and confirming the situation was still active. There was urgency in every message, but also uncertainty. It was the kind of call that could shift at any moment. She adjusted her gear again, checking everything without being told. Her movements were precise, practiced. Even in the tension, her breathing remained steady. Inside, she could feel the weight of expectation pressing down. Not just from the situation but from the people around her. She knew they were watching. Not openly, not all the time, but enough. Waiting for hesitation, for doubt, for proof that their assumptions were right. She refused to give it to them. The vehicle slowed as they approached the location. There were no clear markers, no obvious signs. Just a stretch of land that felt isolated, quiet in a way that didn't sit right. The driver brought the vehicle to a stop. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the doors opened. The outside air felt different, still, almost too still. The kind of silence that made every small sound stand out. Boots hit the ground. Equipment was lifted. The team quickly formed a loose structure, scanning the area, preparing for whatever came next. She stepped out with them, her eyes adjusting to the new surroundings. There was no clear path forward. No easy answers, just a situation waiting to unfold. The senior officer glanced at her briefly, then looked away. His expression hadn't changed much, but there was something slightly different now. Not respect, not yet, but attention. The kind that comes before judgment. She tightened her grip on her kit and took a steady breath. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. This was her moment to prove more than words ever could. And somewhere in the distance, faint but growing louder, the sound of something approaching began to rise. Still too far to identify clearly, but enough to remind them that they weren't alone in this. The mission had just begun. The silence of the place felt different once they stepped fully into it. It wasn't peaceful. It was uncertain, like something was waiting just out of sight. The team spread out slightly, scanning the area, listening for any sign that could guide them. The ground was uneven, a mix of dry soil and scattered patches of grass. There were a few structures in the distance, small and worn, barely standing against time. No clear movement, no voices, just the faint whisper of wind moving through open space. She adjusted her grip on her kit and took a slow step forward, her eyes moving carefully across the area. Every detail mattered, the way the ground dipped, the direction of the wind, the quiet that didn't feel natural. Behind her, the others began speaking in low tones, trying to piece together what little information they had received. The call had been unclear. Possible emergency. No confirmed details. Just enough to bring them out here far from anything familiar. The senior officer moved ahead, his posture firm, his eyes sharp. He signaled for the team to stay alert. His confidence hadn't changed, but there was a tension in the way he carried himself now. This wasn't a controlled environment. Out here, things could shift quickly. She followed, keeping a steady pace. She didn't rush, didn't fall behind. She matched the movement of the team, aware of every step. A faint sound reached them, barely noticeable at first, like something shifting in the distance. Everyone paused. The officer raised a hand slightly, signaling stillness. They listened. There it was again. Not loud, not clear, but real. He turned his head toward the direction of the sound, narrowing his eyes. "This way," he said quietly. They moved as a group now, more focused, more alert. Each step was careful, deliberate. The ground beneath them shifted slightly with their weight, small stones rolling, dry leaves cracking softly. As they got closer, the shape of one of the structures became clearer. It looked abandoned at first glance, but something about it felt off. The door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to suggest recent movement. The officer stopped a few steps away, studying it. "Stay ready," he said under his breath. She stepped slightly to the side, giving herself a better angle. Her eyes moved over the structure, the edges of the door, the windows, the shadows inside. She noticed the way the door rested against its frame, not fully settled. It had been moved recently. Her heart rate picked up, but her breathing stayed even. The officer moved forward slowly and pushed the door open further. The sound it made was soft but sharp in the quiet air. Inside, the light was dim. Dust floated in thin beams where sunlight managed to break through. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust. Then they saw it. A figure seated on the ground, leaning against the wall. Still. Too still. The team moved in quickly but carefully. The officer approached first, crouching slightly, trying to assess the situation. She didn't wait to be told. She stepped forward, her focus narrowing completely. Everything else faded. The silence, the tension, the watching eyes behind her. She knelt beside the person, placing her kit down with controlled precision. For a brief second, she took in the scene. The position of the body, the color of the skin, the small details that told a bigger story. Then she began. Her hands moved with confidence, checking for response, monitoring breathing, assessing what needed to be done first. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Behind her, the officer watched closely. At first, his expression was the same, measured, skeptical. But as the seconds passed, something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to show he was paying closer attention now. She spoke softly, not expecting an answer but keeping her voice steady anyway. It was part of the process, keeping control of the moment, even when things were uncertain. The rest of the team stood ready, waiting for direction. For a moment, no one said anything. Then one of them glanced at the officer, as if waiting for him to take over. But he didn't. Instead, his eyes remained on her. She adjusted her position slightly and reached for something in her kit. Her movements were smooth, efficient. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't wasting time either. The air inside the structure felt heavier now, filled with quiet urgency. A faint sound broke the stillness again, this time from above. All heads turned instinctively. It was distant but familiar. The low, rhythmic thump of rotor blades. A helicopter. The team exchanged quick looks. That hadn't been part of the original plan. Not this soon. The officer stepped outside briefly, looking up toward the sky, trying to locate the source. The sound was growing louder, cutting through the stillness of the area. Inside, she didn't stop. She remained focused, continuing her work, adjusting her approach as needed. Her mind stayed clear, blocking out everything that wasn't directly in front of her. After a moment, the officer stepped back inside. "Black Hawk inbound," he said, his tone controlled but slightly surprised. "They're closer than expected." One of the team members frowned. "Did we call for that already?" "Not directly," he replied. "They must have picked up the signal or been redirected." He glanced at her again. She didn't look up, but she heard every word. Her hands didn't slow. The sound of the helicopter grew stronger, the air outside beginning to shift with the force of it. Dust lifted from the ground, swirling in uneven patterns. The team stepped back slightly, preparing for the next phase. The officer moved closer again, watching her work more carefully now. "You've got something?" he asked. She gave a small nod, her voice calm. "There's still time." It wasn't said with emotion, just quiet certainty. He studied her for a second longer than before. Then, without saying anything else, he turned toward the door again, signaling the others to prepare for coordination. Outside, the helicopter was now clearly visible, descending carefully, its presence transforming the quiet landscape into controlled chaos. The wind it created pushed against everything, clothing, equipment, even the ground itself. Inside, she remained steady. The noise didn't distract her. The pressure didn't shake her. If anything, it sharpened her focus even more. For the first time since they arrived, the officer didn't look at her with doubt. He looked at her like he was starting to understand something he hadn't seen before, but he said nothing. Not yet, because the situation wasn't over, and whatever came next would decide everything. The sound of the helicopter filled the air, steady and powerful, pressing down on everything around them. Dust lifted from the ground in swirling waves, brushing against the walls of the small structure and slipping through the open doorway. Outside, the team moved quickly, signaling and adjusting their positions as the Black Hawk descended with careful control. Inside, she stayed exactly where she was. Her focus did not break. She could feel the vibration of the rotor through the ground beneath her knees, but her hands remained steady. She adjusted her position slightly, making sure she had enough space to continue. Every movement she made had purpose. Every second counted. The person in front of her showed faint signs of response now, small, almost unnoticeable changes. It was enough. It meant her efforts were working, even if slowly. She leaned closer, checking again, making sure she wasn't missing anything. Her mind moved quickly, connecting details, building a clear picture of what needed to happen next. Outside, one of the team members called out, trying to coordinate with the helicopter crew. The noise made it difficult, voices rising just to be heard. The senior officer stepped forward, taking control of the communication, his experience showing in the way he handled the situation. But even as he spoke, his eyes kept shifting back toward the doorway, toward her. He watched the way she worked. Not rushed, not unsure, but fully present in the moment. It didn't match the picture he had formed earlier that morning. Not even close. Inside, she reached for her radio. The signal crackled for a second before clearing. "This is ground unit," she said, her voice calm despite the noise around her. "We have one patient, responsive but unstable. We'll need immediate extraction support." Her words were clear, direct, no wasted language. Outside, the officer paused mid-instruction. He turned slightly, listening more carefully now. The helicopter hovered just above landing height, waiting for confirmation. The crew inside needed information fast, clear, confident direction to act safely. For a brief moment, there was hesitation in the air. Not from her but from the team around her. This wasn't the usual chain of command. This wasn't how things typically flowed. But the situation wasn't typical either. The radio responded, the voice from the helicopter firm but open. "Ground unit. Confirm condition and landing feasibility." She didn't look up. She didn't hesitate. "Condition is time-sensitive," she replied. "Landing zone is limited, but stable enough if approached from the west side. Wind direction is shifting slightly. Adjust angle by 10 degrees. Outside, the officer's expression changed. He hadn't expected that level of detail. Not this quickly. The crew in the helicopter responded again, their tone sharper now, more engaged. "Copy that. Adjusting approach." The officer stepped closer to the doorway, watching her more closely than ever. She continued speaking into the radio, giving short, precise updates. Every word mattered. Every instruction was measured. And the helicopter responded. Not with doubt, with action. Above them, the Black Hawk shifted slightly in the air, adjusting its angle just as she had suggested. The movement was smooth, controlled, showing complete trust in the information they were receiving. One of the team members outside glanced at the officer, confusion clear on his face. "They're taking her direction?" The officer didn't answer right away, because he was watching it happen. Inside, she finished her transmission and set the radio aside. Her attention returned fully to the patient. She adjusted her position again, checking progress, making sure everything was aligned for the next step. The sound of the helicopter grew louder for a moment as it lowered carefully, finding the narrow space she had described. The wind pushed harder now, pressing against the structure, rattling loose pieces, carrying dust through the air. But still, she didn't rush. She worked through the noise, through the pressure, as if none of it mattered more than the person in front of her. The officer stepped inside again, his movements slower this time. He crouched slightly, not to take over, but to see more clearly. "What do you need?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it was the first time he had asked it like that. Not as a test, as support. She glanced at him briefly, then back to her work. "We'll need a clear path, and steady hands when we move." He nodded once, immediately turning to signal the others. Within seconds, the team shifted into position. The hesitation from earlier was gone. In its place was something else: focus, alignment, quiet urgency. The helicopter settled just enough to make extraction possible, its presence filling the space with controlled intensity. The crew inside waited, ready to act the moment they were needed. She took a slow breath. "Now," she said. The team moved together, carefully, precisely. Every step was coordinated, every movement deliberate. They followed her lead without question, adjusting as she guided them through it. There was no confusion, no overlap, just a clear flow of action. The officer stayed close, supporting where needed, but not interfering. For the first time, he wasn't leading the moment. She was, and he knew it. As they reached the doorway, the wind from the helicopter pressed against them, strong enough to challenge their balance. Dust filled the air, making it harder to see clearly. But her voice cut through it. "Stay low," she said. "Move steady." They listened, because now there was no doubt left in the room. Outside, the helicopter crew leaned out, ready to receive. Their movements were sharp, practiced, but they were watching her closely, waiting for her signal. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto theirs for just a second. Then she nodded. The transfer began. Hands met hands. Weight shifted carefully. Every second felt stretched, filled with quiet tension. Then it was done. The patient was secured inside the helicopter. For a brief moment, everything paused. The wind still roared. The blades still turned. But inside that moment, something changed. The officer looked at her again. Really looked this time. Not as someone to question, but as someone he had misjudged. She didn't react to the moment. Didn't look for recognition. She simply stepped back, adjusting her gear, already thinking about what came next. The helicopter crew gave a quick signal before preparing to lift. One of them glanced down at her, giving a small nod, silent acknowledgement. Then the Black Hawk rose, slowly at first, then with growing speed, lifting away from the ground and into the open sky. The sound faded gradually, leaving behind a quieter space. The dust settled, the air stilled, and for the first time since they arrived, there was a sense of calm. The team stood there for a moment, watching the helicopter disappear into the distance. No one spoke, because there wasn't much left to say. The officer finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than before. "You handled that," he said. "It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real." She didn't look at him right away. She finished adjusting her gear, then met his gaze. "We all did," she replied. He held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod. But deep down he knew the truth. That moment had belonged to her, and everything he thought he knew that morning no longer held the same weight. Still, the day wasn't over, and something about the way she carried herself told him there was more to her story than anyone had taken the time to see. He glanced once more at the empty sky where the helicopter had disappeared, then back at her, and for the first time he didn't see doubt. He saw strength, the kind that doesn't need to be proven with words, the kind that shows up when it matters most. And he couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound of the helicopter slowly faded into the distance, leaving behind a strange kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that comes after intense movement, when the body is still alert but the moment has already passed. Dust still hung lightly in the air, settling over the ground, over the equipment, over the boots of the team that remained. No one moved for a few seconds. It was as if everyone needed time to understand that it was over. Then, slowly, the team began to relax their positions. Shoulders dropped slightly. Hands loosened their grip on gear. The urgency that had filled every second of the last moments began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet awareness of what had just happened. She stood near the doorway of the structure, adjusting her gloves calmly. Her breathing had already returned to normal. Her focus, however, had not fully left. She was still observing, still processing, still mentally reviewing every step that had led to this point. Across from her, the senior officer stood still. He wasn't speaking. Not yet. His eyes followed the space where the helicopter had disappeared, then slowly returned to the ground, to the structure, and finally to her. His expression was different now. Subtle but noticeable. The sharp confidence he carried earlier had softened into something more thoughtful. One of the team members broke the silence first. "That was fast coordination," he said quietly, almost as if speaking too loudly would break something fragile in the air. Another nodded. She gave them exact landing adjustments. They followed it like they trained with her before. No one argued, because it was true. The officer finally moved, stepping slightly away from the doorway. He looked at the ground for a moment, then exhaled slowly. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was reflection. He had seen many operations in his years of service. Many good responders, many strong teams. But what had happened here was different in a way he couldn't ignore. He turned slightly toward her. She was still checking her kit, making sure everything was secure, as if nothing significant had just happened. There was no celebration in her movements, no visible pride, just routine discipline. That was what stood out the most. The officer spoke quietly. "You gave them landing adjustments without hesitation." She looked up briefly. The conditions were clear. He studied her for a moment. "They trusted you immediately." She didn't respond right away. She tightened a strap on her bag, then answered simply. "They needed information. I gave it." It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't confidence trying to prove itself. It was just fact. That made it harder for him to dismiss. The wind outside had started to settle, though small gusts still moved through the open space. The team slowly began gathering equipment, preparing to move out. The structure behind them creaked slightly, as if relieved that the pressure of the helicopter's force had passed. The officer walked a few steps away, then stopped again, clearly thinking. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "Earlier, I misjudged the situation." The words didn't come easily. They weren't loud, but they carried weight. She paused for a second, not because she was surprised, but because she was measuring the moment. Then she replied, "We were focused on the mission." He turned back toward her now. "That doesn't change what I said." Silence followed. The team nearby stayed quiet, sensing the shift in tone. She looked at him directly for the first time since the operation had begun. Her expression was steady, not emotional, not defensive. "People say things under pressure," she said calmly. "It happens in the field." He nodded slightly but didn't look satisfied with that answer. "It shouldn't happen without reason." That was honest. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke again. "What matters is what happens after." That statement stayed in the air. He didn't respond immediately, because he understood what she meant. Out here, mistakes were common. Judgments were quick. But what separated good teams from weak ones wasn't perfection. It was recovery. It was how people adjusted after they realized they were wrong. The team finished packing their equipment. Radios were checked one last time. Vehicles were signaled in the distance, ready to return them to the station or redirect them to the next call. But something still felt unfinished. The officer finally spoke again, this time softer. "You didn't hesitate once during that entire operation." She looked back at her kit. "There was no time for hesitation." "That's not what I mean," he said. She paused. He continued. "Even when things shifted, when the helicopter came in, when the pressure increased, you didn't change your approach." She zipped her bag closed slowly. "Changing approach without reason causes mistakes." He nodded slightly, as if accepting that, but his eyes stayed on her. Most people adjust when they feel pressure from others. She finally stood upright. Pressure doesn't change facts. That was all she said. But it was enough. The officer looked away for a moment, as if absorbing it. Then he exhaled again, slower this time. Around them, the team began to move toward the vehicles. The mission site was being cleared. Everything was returning to procedure. But the atmosphere had changed. There was no longer doubt hanging in the air. There was awareness. Awareness that something had been misunderstood earlier. Awareness that assumptions had been challenged. As they walked back, one of the younger team members quietly spoke to another. "I thought she was new to field work." The other replied, "She's not moving like it." The officer overheard but didn't interrupt, because he was thinking the same thing. When they reached the vehicles, she took her usual seat again without hesitation. The same calm posture, the same controlled movements. Nothing had changed outwardly, but internally, something had shifted in how the team looked at her. The drive back began slowly. The terrain outside passed in familiar patterns now. Dusty roads, scattered vegetation, distant structures fading into the background. The urgency of earlier had fully disappeared, replaced by quiet travel. Inside the vehicle, no one spoke at first. The officer sat across from her again. This time, his posture was less rigid. Not relaxed exactly, but no longer guarded. After a long silence, he spoke. "You've been in high-pressure operations before," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Yes." Another pause. "Not many people can coordinate air support like that on their first week with a unit," he added. She turned her gaze back to him briefly. "I wasn't coordinating alone. I was responding to what was happening." He accepted that answer but didn't let it go. "Still, they listened to you immediately." She didn't respond this time. Outside, the landscape continued to move past them. The road stretched long and empty ahead. The officer leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. Not in dismissal this time, but in thought. "I was wrong earlier," he said again, quieter. She didn't react dramatically. No smile. No satisfaction. Just a small pause. Then she said, "It's understood." But the way she said it wasn't dismissive. It was simply final. The conversation ended there. Still, the silence in the vehicle felt different now. Less heavy. More reflective. As they neared the station, the officer looked out the window, watching the familiar buildings come into view again. The routine world waiting for them felt different now than it had that morning. He thought about the words he had said earlier. About strength. About expectations. About assumptions made too quickly in a job where every second mattered. When the vehicle finally stopped at the station, the team began stepping out. Equipment was unloaded. Reports would be written. Procedures would continue as always. But something had already changed. As she stepped down from the vehicle, the officer called out one last time. She paused and looked back. He hesitated for a second, then said, "Next assignment briefing starts tomorrow. Same time." She nodded once. Understood. Then she turned and walked toward the station entrance, blending back into the flow of movement like she had always been there. The officer watched her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked away, because now he understood something he hadn't before. Strength wasn't always loud. And sometimes, the person you doubt the most is the one who carries the entire moment without ever needing to prove it out loud. The station had returned to its usual rhythm, but it didn't feel exactly the same anymore. The sounds were familiar. Radios clicking, boots moving across concrete, engines being checked. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. People still worked quickly, still followed routine, but there was a subtle awareness in the way some of them glanced at her as she moved through the space. She noticed it but didn't react. She never did. Her focus stayed on the work in front of her. She cleaned her gear, checked supplies, and reviewed the next schedule without hesitation. To her, the mission from earlier was already part of the past. What mattered now was the next call, the next situation, the next moment where preparation would matter more than memory. Still, not everyone had moved on so quickly. The senior officer stood near the planning board, reviewing notes that had been written after the operation. His expression was controlled, but his thoughts were not fully settled. Every time he looked at the report, his mind went back to the structure, the radio instructions, the helicopter adjusting its approach based on her voice. It didn't fit the expectation he had carried when he first saw her, and that realization stayed with him longer than he wanted. He had worked with many responders over the years. He had seen experienced teams break under pressure, and inexperienced ones rise in unexpected ways. But what bothered him wasn't that she had performed well. It was how quickly he had dismissed her before she had even been given space to act. That part stayed in his mind. Across the room, another team member quietly said, "The Black Hawk crew said they'd never received landing instructions that precise in a field call." The officer heard it, but didn't respond immediately. He already knew that. What he was still processing was why he hadn't believed it could come from her. Later that evening, the station grew quieter as shifts changed. Some teams left for rest. Others prepared for overnight duty. The light outside turned softer, casting long shadows across the ground. She remained behind for a routine equipment check. It wasn't unusual for her. She often stayed longer than required, making sure everything was in order. It gave her clarity, structure, a sense of control after unpredictable moments in the field. She was tightening a strap on her pack when footsteps approached from behind. She didn't turn immediately. She recognized the pace. It was him. The senior officer stopped a short distance away, as if unsure how to begin. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands resting loosely at his sides. Finally, he spoke. "You're still here late." She glanced over her shoulder briefly. "Routine check." He nodded once. "Right?" Silence followed. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't casual either. He looked at the equipment she was organizing, then at her posture, the calm way she moved, the lack of unnecessary motion. Everything about her suggested discipline that didn't come from recent training alone. After a moment, he said, "I reviewed the operation report." She paused slightly but didn't stop working. "Okay," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "Your instructions to the aircrew were accurate. They matched their assessment after landing." She nodded once, acknowledging without adding anything. That response made him pause again. He was used to people responding differently, either defensive pride or eager acceptance. But she gave neither, just acknowledgement and continuation. It forced him to slow down his thoughts. "I should have listened earlier," he said after a moment. That time she stopped what she was doing. Not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the weight of what he said. She turned slightly toward him. "Earlier was a high-pressure situation." "I know," he replied. "But that's not an excuse." The honesty in his voice was different from before. It wasn't authority speaking now. It was reflection. She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "People make judgments quickly in the field. It happens." He nodded slowly. "Yes, but not all judgments are harmless." That statement hung between them. She understood what he meant. Because in situations like theirs, assumptions didn't just affect opinions. They affected decisions, timing, trust, and sometimes outcomes. The wind outside moved gently across the open yard, carrying faint sounds from distant activity. The station lights buzzed quietly overhead. He shifted his weight slightly. "When I said what I said earlier, I was wrong." This time he didn't soften it. He stated it clearly. She looked at him for a longer moment, not with surprise, but with careful attention. Then she replied, "Understood." But this time the word carried a slightly different tone. Not dismissal, not indifference, just acceptance without emotional weight attached to it. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been holding since the operation. "I've worked with many people," he said. "I've learned to rely on patterns. Experience tells you what to expect." She nodded slightly. He continued, "But today didn't follow those patterns." There was a brief pause. "And you didn't either." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she finished securing her pack and stood upright. "I follow procedures," she said simply. not expectations. That answer stayed with him, because it clarified something he hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't trying to break assumptions. She was just operating outside of them entirely. He looked at her more carefully now, not as someone to evaluate, but as someone to understand. "You've done similar operations before," he said, more as realization than question. "Yes," she replied. Another pause. "Why this unit?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was curiosity. She hesitated for the first time. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because it wasn't a simple one. "I wanted field deployment," she said after a moment. "Real situations, not simulations." He nodded slowly. That made sense. But there was something more behind her tone that he didn't push into. Instead, he said, "You handled today better than most experienced responders I've worked with." She didn't react outwardly, but she said, "Experience isn't always about time." That statement made him look down for a moment, because it was true in ways people often avoided admitting. The conversation paused again, not because it ended, but because it had reached a quieter point. A few meters away, another crew prepared to leave for a minor call. The station remained active, but the energy was calmer now, less urgent, more steady. He looked toward the yard, then back at her. "I misjudged you," he said again, but softer this time. She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "It won't affect future operations." That answer was professional, clean, detached, but it wasn't cold. It was practical. He nodded once. "No, it won't." A small silence followed. Then he added, "But I will not repeat that mistake." That was the first time she looked at him differently. Not as a senior officer, not as someone assessing performance, but as someone acknowledging change. Still, she didn't respond emotionally. She simply said, "Good," and turned slightly back toward her gear. The conversation ended there, but something between them had clearly shifted. Not friendship, not trust yet, but understanding. A foundation that hadn't existed before. Later that night, she stepped outside for a brief moment. The air was cooler now, the sky darker, filled with scattered stars above the distant horizon. The station lights behind her cast a soft glow across the ground. She stood there quietly, not thinking about recognition or judgment. She rarely did. Instead, she thought about details. The timing of the helicopter arrival, the coordination, the way the team had adjusted once instructions became clear. The way pressure had shaped decisions, not outcomes. Footsteps approached again, but this time she didn't turn immediately. It was another team member, younger, hesitant. "Earlier, when you guided the landing," he said, "how did you know they would listen that fast?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Because they needed a solution," she said. "Not hesitation." He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand it fully. Then he left her alone again. She remained there a little longer, looking at the quiet horizon. There was no pride in her expression, no need for it. What had happened earlier wasn't something she saw as extraordinary. It was simply work done correctly under pressure. But for the people around her, it had changed something deeper. The way they saw strength, the way they saw assumptions, and the way they would approach her from now on. Inside the station, the senior officer stood once more near the planning board. But he wasn't reading anymore. He was thinking about how easily certainty can become a blind spot, and how quickly a moment in the field can undo it. He looked toward the yard, where she stood alone in the distance. This time, he didn't question her presence there. He understood it. And for the first time since the operation began, he no longer saw someone trying to prove herself. He saw someone who already had.